middle of chapter 2, right? Because we talked about culture on Wednesday of last week. Is that correct? Okay, so culture was our major topic. Culture is the major topic for chapter 2. So you should be right smack dab in the middle of that reading assignment that I gave you a couple weeks ago when we started what I call Unit 1. Somebody had a question, what does this Unit 1 mean? I'll call it a Unit 1 test because the unit is the 3 chapters that I said we were going to cover before we have our first test. So today, we're going to finish up covering some stuff about culture in chapter 2, and then move on to chapter 3, which is about socialization. And that socialization is one of those words in sociology class that you have to redefine. Remember the first week when we were taking a lot of notes, we wrote about social facts. And I said, now wait a minute, fact here does not mean truth. Fact means more like reality, the way that we're using it in this particular case. And we also had another word, sociological imagination. Remember? And imagination in this case does not mean make-believe, like a 3-year-old would say. Instead, your imagination is your ability to think and to make connections between pieces of information that you've got. So we redefined what facts meant, and we redefined what imagination means for the sociology class, and we have another word that we're going to look at today, socialization. And that is another word that we have to redefine for ourselves in sociology. It's got a sociology-specific definition. Oh, am I? Oh, okay, we didn't finish our norms? Oh, thank you for stopping me. You know, I'm supposed to ask you anyway where we stopped, so I know where to begin. So, okay. Okay, cliffhanger, we'll have to wait for socialization. I'm not even going to tell you anything about what it means. Right now, you're just going to have to wait for it. Okay, so where did we stop on Monday? Or Wednesday? Oh, okay. So, good, thank you. So we were in the middle of our discussion of norms. We weren't finished with it. Okay, so somebody give me a rundown of what does the word norms mean?
There are social rules, acceptable, inappropriate behavior, and unacceptable, inappropriate behavior.
Okay, yes. So it's social rules, and it's got 2 sides to the coin, right? You've got acceptable behavior, like what society says and your mama says is okay, and you've got the flip side of that, what society says is not okay, and what you're not supposed to do, right? If you want to be, here's my air quotes, normal, okay? So yeah, so this is acceptable behavior, but it's also unacceptable behavior. Appropriate, inappropriate, did I hear you use those words? Yeah, you can use those, any of those kinds of words. Okay, so it's social rules about these 2 things, and you have a longer definition from Wednesday, right? And what's our first type of norms? Folkways, good. Folkways is our first type of norms, and what kind of classification of behaviors do we say folkways? Common everyday behaviors such as what? Brushing your teeth, your hygiene habits, right? Table manners, politeness, how you dress, right? You know, I wore a raincoat today. That's a folkway. Did I have to wear a raincoat? No, it wasn't a law that I broke or anything. So it's commonplace, common everyday behaviors. Commonplace everyday behaviors. Going the speed limit, is that a norm or not? Going the speed limit or breaking the speed limit? Which one's a norm?
Going the speed limit.
Really? You might be the only one on the interstate this morning because this morning I tried to only go 4 miles. I always put my cruise control on 4 miles over. I don't know why. Somebody told me once that they'd leave me alone. I'll get you in just a second. Anyway, and people were speeding around me like crazy. And I was going 4 miles over. So I want to know what the norm is, right? The sign says 70, right? And I don't know what those people were driving. Yes, sir. Oh, I think I do. Here, pass this out. There we go. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So folkways. I guess the speed limit is a folkway. It's a common. It's a thing we deal with every day, and you know, it's not exact. I wouldn't be thrown in jail if I did get pulled over going 74 in a 70. I don't know. What do y'all think? Am I going to get pulled over going 70? No, I'm safe. Really? See what? Do what? Well, if it's a 70-mile-an-hour zone, yeah, like I'm not going to go 74 and a 55, right? That's a different story, right? Because we're talking about a different norm or a different expected thing, okay? So anyway, yeah, some of these norms, in other words, are debatable, kind of, or maybe we should say that they are in the eye of the beholder. We should say that. Okay, so folkways is the first one, then we covered that on Wednesday. What's the second one? Mores. And what does this one cover?
Behavior based on right versus wrong.
Yes, this is like right versus wrong, or good versus evil. Morality stuff. You might see a similarity between the word mores and the word morality. They come from the same root. So morality is that kind of right versus wrong that we're talking about here. We're not talking about, somebody getting a bad haircut and you say, oh, she was just wrong for doing that. Not that kind of wrong, okay? We're talking about, that was a bad example, but you see what I'm saying here. We're talking about right versus wrong from a morality sense. And mores, are they more important or less important than folkways in a society?
I think more.
If we haven't said already for sure that they're more, mores are typically more important behaviors than folkways. More important for like the structure of society. When I say more important than folkways, more important for the structure of society. If all of a sudden we stopped using a fork or spoon to eat mashed potatoes and we used our fingers instead, is American culture going to change so very much? No. But if all of a sudden society said, wait a minute, we're not going to have monogamy in marriage anymore. What does monogamy mean? Monogamy is one spouse with another spouse and only those two spouses, right? But instead we're going to have polygamy. What does that mean? Multiple spouses, right? More than two spouses, that is, okay? So if we all of a sudden said, we're going to change this more, because do we see that as a morality issue, having sex with a whole bunch of people at once?
Yes.
We see that as a morality issue. And so would that change society significantly if all of a sudden we had multiple marriages allowed at the same time?
To an
Yeah.
extent, that's already
It would change quite a bit. You're right. We'll talk about marriage patterns in the U.S. I heard you say to an extent it's already happening. But right now, don't you have to get rid of one before you can get the other?
Not necessarily.
Yes, you do. Yes, you have to get rid of one before you get the other because of the third type of norms, which is where we left off, right? So we were on this one, and we left off with let me put number 3 up here. Number 3 is laws. Laws are a type of norm. Laws are written down rules. Written down social rules about what's acceptable and unacceptable. Laws are written down and they can range from not very important at all to extremely important, like murder and rape and molestation and those kinds of things, right? So not important at all to extremely important. Give me an example of a law that you might know about that you would say is not so important at all.
Like we was talking about jaywalking.
Oh, did we talk about jaywalking? Yeah.
It's also not just punishment, though. It's you can be awarded as well, right?
For
Like
what do you mean?
A medal of honor or something.
Oh yes, you can be rewarded for good behavior. Yes, that should be a word that we covered on Wednesday also, right? The word sanction. So a sanction can be written down, and you have like a checklist. So if you're talking about like military honors, yes, did they do this, these good things, right? These highly acceptable, over the top acceptable, approved of, beyond expectation. And so you can get a positive sanction, a reward, a Medal of Honor as your example, or be on the dean's list or the chancellor's list, right? Because you've gone over and above what those grade expectations are for college level work, right? So laws are written down, and the sanctions for violating laws are written down also. Yeah, so some laws that are extremely important have high sanctions. And those sanctions are supposed to serve as what we call a deterrent. If you know you can get in trouble in this particular very unpleasant way, are you more or less likely to do the thing? Right, so that's what the deterrent is. Just like with a little kid, I'm going to get you, I'm going to spank you if you do this. Right, see my finger, you my tone of voice, I'm communicating a message. Right? Or I'm going to get you an ice cream cone, you've been so good. Right? So those sanctions can reinforce, or they can make you start to think twice about what actions you're doing. On the extreme micro scale, with little kids. Right? In society, it can work the same way. In principle, that's the idea, that it works the same way. Laws are written down. They range from not so important to extremely important. And these are our 3 types of norms. So I bet you I didn't draw you my picture either. I did draw the picture? Okay. Usually I don't draw the picture until I've talked about all 3 of these. But anyway, yeah, so any of you could basically say that picture of norms that I drew with the acceptable on one side, unacceptable on the other side, uncertain in the middle, because there's all kinds of behaviors that we are capable of doing that just might not be part of the customs, part of the traditions, part of the rituals, part of etc. All those things that are on our list of parts of culture, components of culture. They might not be acceptable, right? Can some things be acceptable in one situation but not acceptable in another situation?
Yeah.
Like what? Humor, absolutely. Humor or informal behavior versus formal behavior, the style of dress that we might choose, right? We don't have a split personality, but we assess each situation that we move from during our day, right? We have one situation that we move from to the next during our day, and based on what we know the expectations are, what we know the acceptable side is, we will opt to behave in certain ways, dress in certain ways, say certain things, not say certain things, right? Some of you might have tattoos that you don't want a certain family member to see because you just don't want to hear it, right? So you go through certain steps to make sure that you always wear a certain kind of shirt to hide it or something, right? Because you just don't want to deal with that situation. So we're constantly assessing, we're constantly making judgment calls about who our audience is and who we're going to please or displease, are we going to stick out, are we going to fit in, all of these different kinds of things. We are using this knowledge about norms on a daily basis when we go through our behaviors. Questions? We're good? Okay. Now we can move on to that socialization word, because let me ask you a question. How do we get to know what norms are for our society? That is the correct answer. Socialization is the right answer. What must socialization mean in that case? How is it that we discover what these things are? Interactions with the people who are around you. And through interactions, we learn what is expected, what is unexpected, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. But here, let me ask you this question. Does every single household, so think on the micro scale, when I say family here, I'm not talking about family as a social institution, but let's talk about one family situation to the next. Does every family follow the same norms inside their household? No. So we talked about subcultures in class on Wednesday, right? And so each subculture has a different set of, that's where our picture of norms comes in, right? We have that line where we have an acceptable over here, whatever side I put it on. It's a great big range of acceptable behavior. But I might be right here with my behavior, and you might be right here with your behavior. So I might think I might be a little ethnocentric about you. What's ethnocentrism mean?
Judging based off your standards.
Judging based off your own standards. we might be perfectly within this acceptable range. Here's unacceptable way over here. Neither of us are touching this unacceptable part over here. None of us. But you're up here and I'm down here, and so we're so far away from each other, we might be part of the same acceptable side of norms, but we are different and we recognize each other's differences. Make sense? So these differences that we're talking about, we're going to learn these differences in something called the socialization process, where the folkways in this household are, based on this picture, are definitely different than the folkways in this household. The mores in this household might be different than the folkways in the laws that are considered important or not important might be different in this household than this household, but everybody's still in the acceptable range. Make sense? Okay. So whatever kind of profession any of you are going in, I always have a lot of culinary students, I always have a lot of medical, pre-med kind of students, whether you're going into nursing or radiology or any of those kinds of degrees. Are you going to encounter in your career life lots of different clients from lots of different subcultures, from lots of different ways of life? The answer is yes. I see all of your heads bobbing up and down. Yes, and so that's one of the reasons why this sociology class is on all of your degree plans, right? It's like one of the ones right up at the top, encouraging you to choose it, because just the awareness that all of us have our differences, yet all of us can be perfectly within the acceptable range within our society, just that knowledge helps us, can I say, back off or learn to back off of our ethnocentrism a little bit? Because all of us are ethnocentric, remember, it's not a bad thing. Accusing you of anything, I'm ethnocentric too. But we have to be aware that we are, and we have to kind of put ourselves in check a little bit to make sure that we're not, judging others unfairly just because we think we're the bomb and you're different than me, right? Okay, and we learn these differences, we learn to be our own way during something called the socialization process. Deja vu, right? I've seen this on the board before, yes. The socialization process. So remember, I mentioned a minute ago, we're going to have to redefine this word for ourselves, because I hear a bunch of folks using it to mean they're hanging out, they're visiting, they're getting together, they're catching up with each other. They're at a party, they're mingling. I hear people using that word to talk about hanging out with friends. Do y'all say I'm socializing with such and such sometimes? It might be a fancy word that you don't say very often, but in everyday casual speech, I typically hear this word to mean like visiting, getting together with friends. Put in your margins someplace beside this word that this, like the word facts, like the word imagination from week 1, we have to redefine this for ourselves in sociology. It does not mean visiting. It doesn't mean hanging out. It's referring to a learning process. Whether you say socialization by itself in this class or you say socialization process in this class, we're talking about a learning process. And a minute ago, Max used the word interaction, and that's key to the learning process. So, here's the way. Let me give you some key terms that have to be in a definition of socialization for it to be thorough and correct. Okay? First of all, socialization is learning. Socialization is a learning process. Your college career is a learning process, right? It's a formal learning process. You're here at 8 o'clock in the morning, you've got your notebooks open, you're taking notes, you're following the folk ways of the classroom right now. You learned those folk ways since when? Pre-K, all the way up to now. You learned that this was classroom folk ways. This learning process that we're going through right now is a formal learning process. School creates formal learning processes. But socialization, the learning processes, aren't limited to the formal way that we sit in the classroom and learn how to read or learn how to write or learn how to do math. The learning process in social interaction in socialization is caused by all of your social interaction that you have had your whole life. Is this social interaction formal? Okay, then it's part of your socialization process. Is it informal? Like grandpa teaching you how to grill a hamburger on the outside grill? Informal socialization process, but you're learning something, right? Or is your social interaction between, instead of another individual, is your social interaction on social media or through TV or Netflix or something? Social interaction can be informal with another person, informal with social media, informal with you and simply a TV show. You don't have to have another person to talk to or a cat to talk to or whatever, right? You don't have to have another animate object in the room with you right there. It can simply be you're watching a movie. We can learn from a movie. You can learn from a movie. Student last semester had a 5-year-old who, when you ask him, what's he going to be when he grows up? He says Spider-Man, his favorite movie. We learn from movies. Does he have the mental ability yet to know whether Spider-Man is actually a real profession that you can go into? No, he doesn't. And that's part of where in this chapter about the socialization process, chapter 3, we're going to overlap what we know from psychological studies about the capacity of the human brain to this learning process of how socialization, how we develop our system of norms, how we learn that acceptable or unacceptable side. Okay? So, socialization has to have this word in a good definition. It has to say that learning happens through social interaction, if it's a good definition. And it also has to indicate that the learning process itself is lifelong. Lifelong. When does life begin? Here's a good question. Because when does this lifelong learning process start? You have some folks who will tell you, well, I'm pregnant, I talk to my baby all the time, I let my baby listen to music, I have my baby's daddy talk to the baby all the time, the baby's not born yet. So some people will argue there's a learning process that starts then. In socialization, in sociology class, we're going to say that lifelong is from physical birth to death. First breath to last breath. Immediately at birth, interaction experiences begin to happen. We can't remember them, but interaction and experiences begin to happen. And we learn. We start learning as early as birth. But our brains aren't developed like your and my brains are developed now, right? So at birth, just like your skeleton is going to develop a whole lot before you're grown, your brain is still going to develop too. How many of y'all have had psychology class?
I have it right now.
Where you have it right now, so even if you're in it right now, you've talked about connections that are made through the learning process, right? So you haven't talked about it yet, but you will, okay? So connections in the brain where neurons link so that you can gain information and learn from information and that kind of thing. There's a physical process that goes on in our bodies physically from birth to death. So it affects the kinds of things we can learn through this social interaction and that learning process, early on and toward death. Okay? Why do we have to constantly learn? Why can't there just be like, by the time we're 10, we know everything we need to know? Not only, When you say stuff changes, do you mean stuff like around us changes?
Like, yeah.
Like
the type of stuff that we do, or like, I don't know, the norms.
norms change over time? That's absolutely a correct observation. Norms don't stay the same from one year to the next, let alone one decade to the next, right? So norms change all the time, and there's one reason why we would have to be in a constant learning process. I heard somebody else offer another explanation, I think. Anybody?
There's too much to learn in that amount of time.
There is a whole bunch to learn, and so there's too much, and maybe not all of it that there is to learn do we need to know for our successful lifetime, right? But also, do we change? When you're 10, your brain, just like we just said, your brain's not fully developed yet, right? I don't really know what the current research says until how long, your brain is fully developed, but I do know that people with brain injuries can develop new neural pathways, right, to kind of compensate, right? So there's all kinds of research into that brain development thing, but for sure, if I'm talking about 10 years old, your brain is not developed fully yet. We'll look at some psychologists who studied that specifically. What are the age ranges where brain development kind of makes a leap and you can comprehend more complicated things, and then another leap and you can understand even more complicated things, right? So we change, and when we're 10, we might really have some great hobbies that we love and we know how to do certain things, but when we're 20, are those hobbies necessarily going to still be appropriate for a 20-year-old when they were for a 10-year-old? And then when you're 30, are those hobbies necessarily when you were 20, you're still going to be socially expected to do those, or is there a different social expectation that you have to fulfill, right? So social expectations change as we move through our lifespan. Stuff around us changes, as you pointed out, as we move through our lifetime. We're adjusting to that kind of thing. And as society changes, the expectations of our age group changes over time too. So it's a constant learning process. Constant. Okay. Is it correct here to say we need to fill in what we learn? We know that socialization is a lifelong learning process and we learn through social interaction. Is it correct, think about this for a second, for me to say what we learn is we learn social norms? Is it correct for me to say that?
Well, I think there's sort of,
There's a lot of wells going on. You're right for these wells. Well, what do you think?
I think there's some that you're sort of born with. Like, I think when you're maybe young, you know that hitting another toddler is bad.
Actually, in sociology, when we discuss the socialization process, we do not accept generally the notion that anyone is born knowing anything about how to behave within their social group. So if when you were a toddler, you recall that you weren't supposed to hit another toddler, you weren't born with that behavior. Someone taught you, someone trained you, if you will. And in psychology, you talk about operant conditioning. So someone trained you to have that behavior. Just like with sharing, I love to see like a kindergarten teacher. It's usually kindergarten. It's usually that age group where you see a whole bunch of kids come together for maybe for the first time, but in daycare also, where you try to teach them how to share and the importance of sharing. And you're telling like a 5-year-old, it's important to share because of all these wonderful reasons that can come from the camaraderie and the diplomacy of sharing. A 5-year-old doesn't comprehend the reasons. A 5-year-old is just going to remember that I have to let you play with this toy too because the teacher said so. And the teacher sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher if there's any, to the 5-year-old, if there's any kind of philosophical reason offered as to why sharing needs to take place, right? So I'm glad that nobody just said, oh yeah, we learn norms in our socialization process, because it's technically, we can't assume that everybody learns norms, right? Because who do you learn from? You're going to learn from your immediate social group. Your immediate social group's behaviors is what you're going to learn. You're going to learn your immediate social group's behavior. You're going to learn your immediate social group's condition of living. Were you born into poverty? Were you born into middle class? Were you born into wealth? You're going to learn those habits that are for that condition in life. You're going to learn attitudes of your immediate social group. Are you going to learn tolerance, or are you going to learn racism? You're going to learn this stuff. You're going to learn your immediate social group's behaviors. You are not born with a meter or a gauge or some kind of warning alarm that's going to tell you, the 2-year-old, this behavior that mommy's doing is not, on the macro scale, socially acceptable. There's no way for a 2-year-old to discern that for him or herself. For instance, true story. Y'all want me to tell you a true story?
Sure.
So, some friends of my husband and me had a little baby. They owned a mechanic shop. Really, they did really, really well for themselves. Owned a mechanic shop, and the culture, the small scale, micro scale culture in that mechanic shop was that everybody cussed all the time. You and I would probably say they were cussing. They said words like shit all the time. They said the F word all the time. They said piss all the time. They said other, damn it all the time. They said all these words all the time. Nobody even, it would just, that's just what it was like there. So it wasn't shocking, like you might be shocked in other circumstances. You go into the doctor's office and the nurses are cussing up a storm. You might not expect that, right? In the mechanic shop, it's fine. Nobody cared. They had a baby. They owned the shop, so they didn't have to put her in daycare. They brought her to the shop with them every single day. Had a little pack and play, whatever. I see you smiling because guess what? Yeah. Guess what words she learned? She learned all those cuss words but she didn't have a category for one kind of word and another kind of word. She just didn't have that category. She just learned how to cut. They would say the F word as a good adjective, like it's an effing beautiful day outside. People do that sometimes. They would do it all the time. Hand me that effing wrench over there. Where's my effing oil gauge? I don't know. They would say it all the time. Didn't think about it. What did she learn to say? Those words. During potty training, they would ask her things like, do I need to wipe your ass for you? Did you take a piss? Did you take a shit? They would ask her these questions. They needed to know the answer to these questions. Right? But you go to kindergarten, and you have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom, and what do you tell your kindergarten teacher? And then what kind of sanction do you... She hasn't gotten any sanctions. She learned the behaviors from her immediate social group, Veronica. She learned the behaviors from her immediate social group. Did anybody ever, apparently from her behavior that I described to you, did anybody ever make her think at any time that saying those words was inappropriate?
Apparently not.
No, apparently not. So you learn the behavior of your immediate social group. Okay? She did. And the first sanctions she ever got from it were in kindergarten. Because she was just speaking like anybody else would speak to each other on the playground. But she knew some words that the other kids did not know yet. Or if they had heard them, they weren't allowed maybe to use them. And the teacher punished her. Do you think the other kids, where would she get sanctions from, in other words? So I'm asking you about sanctions. You might need to flip back to Monday to make sure you remember what sanction means. But she got some sanctions, definitely from the teacher.
Oh, little kids too, like, were you not supposed to say
Well,
that?
yeah, do you think the little kids would, if they knew ahead of time, they might tell her, oh, you said a bad word.
Yeah.
Now you've got a box to put these words in. Here's some words that are bad, and here's some other words that are not bad. And so she's learning the difference and how to compartmentalize these words. But what else? So maybe the little kids maybe the kids around her go home, and what do they do at home? They say these new words that they learned at school. And what do their parents say to them? Do their parents sanction them?
Yep.
Right? And so then they come back to school and, my mommy said, you shouldn't say damn it, or whatever. Right? And then it's time for the little girl to have a slumber party and have a birthday party and a slumber party, and she sends out invitations. And do you think the parents might allow their children to go to that house or not allow? Right? So there could be all kinds of sanctions. There's no, as far as I know, there's no student handbook rule in kindergarten that says no cussing. Maybe, I don't know when that might start. It's probably in some student handbook someplace, but it's probably up farther in elementary school than that. But she got formal sanctions from the teacher, who started to let her know at an early age that behavior, or the condition of saying those words freely, the attitude that it was okay, is not okay for the larger social norms in society. Right?
So would an informal sanction from the teacher be like if she laughed?
Yes, laughing could communicate the wrong message, but yes, absolutely. A laugh is definitely a sanction, because, if you laugh at something that a little kid does, it could say, oh, they like that. Happiness is laughter, and happiness is the result that I want. So they might, interpret that differently.
Like a reward, like if the kids start laughing too, it would be like the sanction of a reward for their.
Because sanctions can be reward or punishments. So if my sanction is unclear and you take it to be a happy thing, then that message is reinforced that I should do this if I like the laughter, if I'm not embarrassed by it or something, right? Yeah. So on the micro scale, with sanctions like that, with our immediate social group is what we learn our behaviors from. We can't necessarily say that in the socialization process we learn social norms, because not every micro-scale social group displays macro-scale approved of social norms, right? There's all kinds of catches though, where we can try to make sure that you learn these things. Okay, so look at your textbook, like first couple of pages of chapter 3, and look at the definition of socialization, please, that your textbook author puts in a nice, pretty sentence, and tell me if we've left anything out, any keywords out.
Self-identity.
Self-identity, exactly. Self-identity we've left out. This is a tricky one that we will talk about, that we get a lot from these informal sanctions that we were just discussing. Yeah, there's a key word that we've left out here. Let me see, here's a bullet point, and here, let's put self-identity. What does that mean to you? What does that concept, self-identity, mean?
Do you identify yourself?
You have to not use those words in the definition.
Who you are as a person and stuff that makes you.
Your ideas about who you are as a person. Yes. Who you are as a person within yourself. What your personality is like. Am I likable? Am I dislikable? Am I smart? Am I a dummy? These kinds of things. Anywhere in between. Where do we get those concepts from? In sociology class, we discuss several ideas, several theories about how through the socialization process we learn to behave the way that we do. We learn to have attitudes about who we are as individuals, and we get that from interaction with others. Very big difference here than a psychology class where we would discuss things like personality types and different kinds of life experiences that might push you toward a certain personality type, but it's kind of internal in a psychology class. In sociology class, self-identity, personality, attitude, self-esteem, these words come from social interaction, learning from interactions with others, learning attitudes about us as individuals, learning attitudes about others as individuals, and these attitudes can change over time from birth to death. Okay? Self-identity it's an important part of the socialization process, and on Wednesday we'll talk a lot about ideas of self-identity, and then also in the next unit when we move on to Chapter 4, after this test that's coming up at the end of this week, we get to look at self-identity in more interesting ways in Chapter 4. Okay, so now we've got all the bullet points that we need for a good definition of the socialization process. Okay? You do not have to memorize the way our textbook author wrote the definition. You write your own definition. Just make sure it hits all these points, and you're correct. Okay? Socialization, lifelong. How important do you think the socialization process is? Now that you know the key points of the definition, how important is this for life in general? How important?
Pretty important.
Pretty darn important. We have one vote for pretty darn important. Anybody think they should have taken psychology class instead of this? Just joking.
No, I mean, it's important because, you're not going to come up to a person from a different culture, right? Them differently, you know what I mean?
Exactly. That's another good point.
It's like if I go up to a patient and they're probably from another part of the country and they come up to me and then I'm trying to treat them the way that I was taught. And they're like, okay.
Exactly. So, knowing about how the socialization process happens, knowing this process in general will help you be more tolerant and expect others to differ from you in certain ways, right? And differing from you does not mean unacceptable, because remember that picture, there's an acceptable side of norms and a huge range of acceptable. So you might be way over here in acceptable, and I'm way over here in acceptable, but we're acceptable. Different, so we're going to have that ethnocentrism kind of fire off sometimes, right? And so understanding how and where these differences come from can help us tolerate those differences, right? Help us pull back from those judgments that we might snap to if we're not careful, right? Since you mentioned patients, I guess you're going into the medical field. I remember a student of mine years ago was an intake person at an ER. You know how you have to go and talk to a nurse before you actually go in the ER, and what's wrong with you, and where does it hurt, and what happened, and how long is it, all those questions. So he told me in one of his reaction papers about culture and socialization, he said that there was a couple who looked like maybe they were from India because of the way that they were dressed. He didn't really know where they were originally from. And the wife was silent the whole time. She was the patient. She was the one with the pain. She was the one who had had the accident and needed the emergency room doctor. But as my student, who was a male, was checking them in to the emergency room, her husband did all of the talking for her. And she never attempted to speak. She never attempted to make eye contact, nothing. And so my student said that because he had had just a little bit of knowledge about how these different kind of socialization, different kinds of norms or different kinds of behaviors we learn in our socialization processes, he said he kind of backed off of the HIPAA requirement to let the patient speak themselves, right? I'm paraphrasing HIPAA, but what's HIPAA? Y'all know what that is?
It's like when you're trying to get information you're not supposed to.
HIPAA is a long medical act. It's basically your privacy, your right to privacy with your medical situation, right? And you have to give people access to your medical record or it's just yours. And so, he knows that the hospital wants him to follow this HIPAA requirement, but apparently, he doesn't know much about the culture that they came from, but apparently, either females are not allowed to speak to males or they're not allowed to conduct professional business, for whatever reason. But he got the information he needed from the husband and processed them on through, right? So sometimes the folkway differences from one culture can maybe touch the law differences in another culture, like the HIPAA thing, right? So yeah, it can help us.
I had a friend that she's Muslim. I think she came from, I don't remember the country she was from, but everybody would think she was only surrounded by Hispanics, since we would be in ESL classes. Well, I was in ESL classes, but she was in that range. And and she said that it's weird. I was just like, men just try to keep talking to me, but where I'm from, I'm not supposed to talk to men.
Right.
So I mean, everybody when they start noticing more, like, okay, she's her country and this and that, she would tell. We would ask her, like, the women, we were like, why you don't want to talk to him? He's like, we're not supposed to.
We're not supposed to, exactly.
So they tend to like, okay, we respect it.
Because we learn behaviors from immediate social group, and if our immediate social group follows the macro scale accepted norms in society, then that's what we learn. And many cultures around the globe, Japan is one, South Korea is one. Maybe did you tell me where your friend was from?
I don't
No.
know where she was from. I know she's just from an Arabic country.
Yeah, Oman or Yemen or someplace like. Yeah, so some countries are much more homogeneous than others. Do y'all know what that word means, homogeneous? Do what?
Not exactly.
Can't remember. Homogeneous means relative. It means all the same, basically. It's made up of the same kind of person. So some cultures don't, in other words, some cultures don't have the diversity that the United States does, where you have all kinds of subcultures, you have all kinds of immigrant cultures, you have all kinds of age groups with different self-identities. In some cultures, there's one self-identity for females, another self-identity for males. There's obligations that are placed on people from the society level, not just the family, immediate social group expectations. So yeah, all of these different observations that you've made about your friend and how she said, oh, in my country, males just don't come up and talk to you, and I'm not supposed to talk to them. Well, that's something she learned in her socialization process, and she was having a little bit of a culture shock, probably. Culture shock is when you experience something vastly different from your own way of life that you learned, and it's hard for you to cope, right? You can react to it in a variety of different ways, but it's hard to cope sometimes when you interact with people from other cultures, or you're immersed in another culture like she was
That's what
here.
happens a lot with me and my husband. He's from Honduras, and we're Mexican, so it's like we tend to like crash a lot on that aspect because they think like, oh no, we're right because we're not home, and it's like, I didn't grow up with that.
Yeah.
So it's
One
like,
of my husband's daughters teaches at the American school in Tegucigalpa, so
it's
we go
so
to Honduras a lot.
weird.
Okay, so socialization process. Anybody want to make any comments or questions, please? Anything else? So we finished, kind of had that discussion to say how important is the socialization process, and I guess the technical academic answer is it's pretty darn important. Or if you're my friend's little daughter, she'd say it's damn important. Okay? So let's talk about how important it is. Okay? So let me erase this and talk about this. Nature versus nurture. Y'all heard that phrase before?
Yeah.
Nature versus nurture? What does that mean to you?
It's very
Man-made?
controversial.
It can be controversial. If it's controversial in our discussion, we're going to agree to, not get upset about it. But yeah, it's a versus, right? I mean, anytime you see a versus, that's not because we're entirely friendly with each other, right? So the haves versus the have-nots, for instance, in conflict theory, is not because they go to picnics together, right? So the versus does mean there's a little bit of controversy here. What else do you know about this already?
Well, I think it was sort of like what I said earlier. Do people, for example, learn something when they're born? Is it just natural to them, or are they...
In their heredity or DNA or something.
Yeah, or do they learn it?
Exactly. So the nature side of this debate here, first of all, this is talking about human behavior in general when we use the nature versus nurture comment or phrase in this class. The nature side is talking about, is there something in your DNA? Is there something in your biological heredity? Is there something, some kind of trait that is a physical thing that you can inherit, that because you are a human being, human beings are a certain way, and therefore it's going to dictate behavior toward a certain direction instead of another direction. That's what the nature side here is talking about. Nature is your biology, your biochemistry, your anatomy and physiology, that class that some of y'all take. That would be the nature side. versus the nurture side, which includes what? Your social environment. Let me make sure that we know it's our social environment. Did I spell that word right? Yeah. Did I? Okay. Ooh. Okay. So our social environment, it is our experiences. The nurture part is also our life experiences. The nurture part is socialization. Now that we have that word, we'll add that to the list. What is more important in humans behaving the way humans do? That's what this debate is about. That's what nature versus nurture means here. And this debate has been around for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, like in ancient Greece. Some of the things Aristotle wrote about was about the nature side versus the nurture side of the condition of being human. Some people, and still today, there's a lot of nature debate when it talks about whether female gender roles or male gender roles are learned, or whether they're because of our biology, they're because of our anatomy and physiology and biochemistry. Right? So there's a lot of, it's extremely complicated. It's extremely complicated, and I am not smart enough to stand here and tell you, oh, this one is the only one that's important, and this is not important at all. No, I'm not here to give you an answer to this, because this probably will never have an answer. You will always have people on that side of the fence, or this side of the fence, or maybe on the fence about this. In sociology class, however, we definitely lean more toward this side of the fence. The nurture side is the learned behavior side. Okay? The nurture side is the socialization side. It's the learning from your immediate social group side. Of course, there are many things that are natural about us that affect our culture. We have to eat. We have to have clean water. We have to sleep. We have to poop and pee. We have to do those kinds of things. But past those kinds of things, do we have culture that tells us foodways, for instance? There's lots of things that are edible in this world, but do we include everything that's edible in our diet that our culture says this is appropriate and this is not appropriate to eat, for instance, right? Yeah. So, and as far as going to the bathroom, sorry to talk about that nature side, but what does one culture have? Y'all know what a bidet is? Y'all heard of a bidet? A bidet is it's like a water fountain where you can clean yourself after you've peed or pooped from the toilet.
Yeah.
Some bathrooms have these things, and that's part of the bathroom process, right? Other bathrooms are just literally a hole in the ground and you squat, right? So there's lots of different customs. There's lots of different customs for that too, right? We have to sleep, but does everybody have the same kind of bedding or a bed at all, right? So there's all kinds of customs, there's all kinds of norms that come up because of the fact that in nature we do have to do certain basic things like other animals do. But the culture part is what's learned over here. Okay? So, remember back to our research discussion back in chapter 1, I don't remember what week it was, maybe week 2, when we talked about how we do sociological research. We have to be really, really careful because we are studying human beings. And because we're studying human beings, we have to, as researchers, we have to protect your human rights. We have to protect your well-being, mental and physical well-being as individuals. So, how could we ever test this? We can debate about it all the time. But how could we ever test whether nurture is more important than nature? We say that it is, but can y'all think of a way we could set up an experiment or some kind of, could we, for instance, get a whole bunch of people who are having babies right now, just donate their baby to science and we lock them in a room for the first 10 years and then open it and see how they turned out? No, We cannot do that, right? Don't leave this room saying, Miss Terrell wants to lock babies in a room for 10 years. No. Okay? No, it's unethical. We cannot do that. So some of the things that we wonder about, some of the things that we are very interested in and are fascinating debates, we can't really ever, for sure, come to the conclusion about it. However, there are some very unfortunate situations that have happened in history. You'll read about them in the first couple of pages of chapter 3. You'll read about a little girl who was called the Wild Child. Her name is Jeannie. Spelled like Jeannie, sorry, left out the I. Oh. Jeannie, like a genie in the bottle. She's known as a wild child. This is the word that you'll see in your textbook, feral. You might be familiar with this word if you talk about wild animals in the forest. Feral is a synonym for the word wild. Feral animal is an untrained animal. So there have been some terrible instances, some terrible examples of abuse in history, and some apparent examples of people getting lost, and separated from a human social group. And Jeannie, particularly, with this feral child that they talk about in chapter 3, I think she was 14 years old when they found her, and she was not potty trained yet. She, there's a picture of her on page 70, if you want to open your textbook and look at her picture. I think she was 14 when that picture was taken. I should have asked you before I told you she was 14, but most people guess she's about 8 or 9. Yeah, she looks much younger than a 14-year-old would look to us today. She had had very little food. She had had very little interaction. Do what? She looks very young. Yeah, she'd had very little food, very little interaction. When a social worker discovered that she existed and rescued her from the terrible abuse situation, people who were trying to rehab her and try to help her recover from her terrible abuse decided that she was so, she wouldn't make any sound. They decided that someone must have beaten her if she cried or beaten her if she tried to speak. She had not learned how to speak. She had not even learned how to walk properly. There's a variety of different ways to walk, but if I walk like this, are you going to see me in the hallway walking like this and think, oh, there goes a normal person? No. She had not had, so we learn how to walk, yes. Our skeleton is shaped the way it's shaped, so we're able to walk like this as opposed to other animals who cannot. But we also walk the way that we walk because it's modeled for us and we copy it. She was never allowed to walk. She was taped to a potty chair for days at a time. Horrible situation of abuse. And she's not the only one. There have been several examples like Jeannie who have been discovered after she has not had the kind of social environment that even my friend's kid who learned how to cuss so well, she's not had that kind of social environment. She's not had life experiences that you would expect a 14-year-old to have if they went through, here's my air quotes, a normal socialization process. She did not have a normal socialization process. She learned behaviors, but her behaviors were to keep quiet, try not to make a sound.
How do they find her?
I think it tells you in the textbook how if I remember correctly, a social worker went to her parents' house. Her parents were elderly. They had her very late in life, very unexpectedly. I don't know how old the mother was when she conceived her and had her, but it was well into her 50s when she conceived her and had her. So there was a social worker coming for some kind of elder care issue, if I remember correctly, and heard something in a room and went to go check it out. and she discovered her and saved her, literally. There's a video that you can find. It might be in my playlist, but on YouTube, if you look up, well, it's called Wild Child, I think. I think it's called Jeannie the Wild Child. It's a Nova video if you want to look it up. And it's got a lot of psychology in it. There's a lot of neuropsychology in it, but from a socialization standpoint, from a sociology standpoint, and from the nurture standpoint, Jeannie had human DNA. Jeannie had human biology. Jeannie had human heredity, anatomy, physiology, all of that on the nurture side. But she did not behave in ways that you and I would expect, again with my air quotes, normal human beings to behave. And the psychologists who Jordan was talking about earlier, at 10 years old, your brain's not developed fully. She was 14, I think, when they found her, 13 or 14, and her brain had not developed at all because she had had no stimulation. So even though they tried to teach her how to talk then, she learned very few words and was reluctant to speak. And you know how a lot of times, well, for women at least, I can speak to that, growing up being trained as how a woman should feel. A lot of times we say that there's a natural feeling that you have for babies as a woman. If you look at Jeannie, they put her in a dress and they gave her a baby doll to play with, and she had no concept of this baby doll represents a little fake human being that I can play with. You know, she twirled it around and tossed it. Because those behaviors that we can observe in that video, and there's lots of footage from her of her rehabilitation, because I think it was the 1970s when she was discovered. So they immediately put TV cameras to try to capture the process of rehabilitating her. But it gives us a lot of information. We cannot set up experiments to withhold nurture to test to see whether nature will take over and they'll just behave like humans anyway. We can't do that. It's a violation of human rights. It's unethical. Unfortunately, we have horrible situations like the situation of Jeannie, and there's a little boy named Victor from the 1800s, I think it was, who wasn't, as far as I recall, he wasn't a victim of abuse, but he probably got lost at a very early age and just fended for him, survived somehow, like in the woods. He was in France. He survived somehow, and he was literally captured. Rescued is not the right word for him because he behaved like a feral animal. He attacked people when they came close to him. So they captured him and took him to try to rehabilitate him. An interesting thing, and there's another video about him on YouTube. It's a very old movie they made about him. I think it's called Victor. Well, search for Victor Wild Child. It'll probably come up. It's not called that. But if I remember correctly, so this kid lived apparently out in nature until he was about 12. I think he was 12 when they captured him. And he hated clothes. He could not stand clothes. They kept clothes on Jeannie, so she would keep her clothes on. But they tried to put clothes on him, and he would rip them off. And he would go outside when it's raining or go outside when it was snowing. And it'd be snowing, and he'd dig himself a little kind of trench in the snow and lay down naked in the snow and sleep for like 2-3 hours. The cold didn't affect him. It's really strange to look at these kinds of things. We can't replicate any of these kinds of situations, but you think that just getting goosebumps and just shivering is like maybe a natural response to the cold situation. In Victor's case, he didn't seem to have that natural response. There are some societies up around the Arctic Circle where they go swimming in 40-degree water regularly, never shiver, never have any goosebumps. I know me neither. No way, I get goosebumps thinking about how cold that is. But those kinds of examples lead us to believe that some of the things that you and I might think is, here's some more air quotes, a natural response is maybe a learned one. Interesting stuff. Y'all should look into that. If you would like to look up any of these videos or look up any of these stories and talk about the socialization process, make sure you don't only just tell me about these stories, but you use one of these stories to teach yourself all those key words in the socialization definition. You use those stories to talk about the nature versus nurture debate. This is like a free pass on an outside source for a reaction paper for this week, if you'd like to search for any of this stuff and investigate it further. Any questions? We're good? Okay, well, I will see y'all on Wednesday then, and make sure that you're here with your reaction paper bright and early.